Hi. Welcome to another edition of Golden Adventures. Today I'm talking about Wings Above Billabong, which was printed in 1935. Obviously it has the race, class and gender themes that you would expect from a book printed in 1935. Alright, this is another of the gold mine books. So what happens in this one? As you can see, planes take a fairly significant role in it. That's the 1950s edition. The scene starts with Freddie Paxham and his friend Jack flying their planes to Billabong, where they're going to help out the gold mine. When they get there, the girls and Bill and Davy are there, but everyone else is out at the mine. They join them. Then there's a break. They go mustering and shearing. It's a nice description of the shearing. Really enthusiastic description of the shearing. Then two of the shearers turn out to be thieves, and they get some information out of one of the maids that Brownie thinks is not really Billabong material. They steal the gold from the hat that's being kept in the house, and they also make off with one of the aeroplanes. They're going to make their getaway in an aeroplane. But Bill interrupts them, so they have to kidnap him and take him along with them. While they're in the air, Bill pokes a hole in the side of the aeroplane and drops the gold. I assume this is like a canvas aeroplane. And then when they land, he escapes and the thieves are caught. So that's what happens in Wings Above Billabong. Rescues. There are none, except potentially you could argue that Bill manages to save the gold by poking it out of the airplane, and even then he's lucky because it lands on someone's chicken house, and it could just as easily have landed on their house or on them. So no rescues, none. I'm going to read to you a little bit from a blurb from the 1950s cover. To hundreds of thousands of young people, there must be magic in the name Billabong, that delightful spot to which Mary Grant Bruce introduced us some years ago when she presented us with The Little Bushmaid. Since then, this popular author has written 14 more stories, either set in Billabong or about the beloved Billabong characters on their journeys abroad. In the meantime, the fame of these adventurous and realistic stories has spread throughout the English-speaking world, and indeed in translated form they are read in many continental countries. Nora, Jim and Wally have long since made their mark as famous characters in fiction and are bosom pals to all their admirers, whether adventuring in the bush or sojourning abroad. So Mary Grant Bruce was the best-selling Australian children's author from 1915 to the mid-1950s, sold over 3 million copies in her lifetime. Right. Well, one of the things that happens in this book is that Bill throws the gold, which is all clumped together in a bundle, out of the plane, and it happens to land on someone's near someone's hen house. It kills their chicken, and he's really lucky that it didn't do any more damage. Anyway, the little old lady that this house belongs to is sees it falling out of the sky, and her first thought is, "Oh no, the Japanese are bombing us." Randomly in 1936, was it 35? Rural Victoria, we're being bombed by the Japanese, which seems odd, but there was a lot of rising tension with the Japanese, of course, at this time with the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and it also feeds into a long-standing Australian literary tradition of fearing invasion from the north by an Asian power. It's a very strange, sort of anxious literary tradition. There's quite a lot of novels which are about how, some vast, really populous Asian state overruns Australia, starting in the north, and maybe isn't even detected at first because it's just completely deserted, and then overruns Australia quite quickly. And that's an ongoing literary tradition because John Marsden's Tomorrow When the War Began belongs to it. And it just reflects the general Australian anxiety of being in the middle of Asia, but not really being an Asian country, and like this general fear, which in this case is specifically of the Japanese bombing them. All right, but I had a look, and I'd also say in some of her later works, which are set during World War II, sorry, I hold it up briefly. That's my 1950s copy of Peter and Co., which was published 1940, and features some kids up in Queensland who managed to foil a Japanese attempt to sort of map the area by submarine because they're preparing for the invasion. And Coralta, which is published in 41. This is a hideous 1940s edition, when I think it must be the economy edition, because it's got really narrow borders and poor print type. Anyway, in Coralta, which is like her second last book, was published 41, there's a German spy, and he's signalling to German subs again, which are in Australian waters. So in this case, not Japanese, but Germans. And in fact, in Peter and Co., Japanese, but with the assistance of German technology. So I thought that was fascinating because it's just so random. Because I've got to say, my first thought would not be, if someone dropped something out of a plane, would not be, oh no, I'm being bombed by the Japanese. I guess I'm not living in the 1930s. That happens in this book is that Bob Raynham borrows, and I've just realised I was probably saying Bob and not Bill when I was talking about the person who was abducted. I meant Bill. I meant the little boy. It's so confusing, this whole Bill Bob thing. Okay, Bob Raynham borrows the aeroplanes because he'd been a pilot during World War One, and he really enjoys it. It fills him with joie de vivre, and also he takes up people who are interested. So he takes up Bill, the little boy, and he takes up Billy, the stock worker. And I have to agree with Brendan Nail, who in her 1979 book suggested that Billy would be an early volunteer for the Australian RAF. He appears to really, really like flying in an aeroplane, which is quite a lot of progress considering that in 1910, when the house was on fire, he was too frightened of the piano to pick it up. But by 1935, he's leaping into the aeroplane. Brendan Nail also did a rough count on Billy's dialogue, the number of words he has. He's got a vocab of about 350 words, and he gets about 1,000 words of total dialogue, and almost all of it is in the last, in the Goldmine books and the last ones, half of them, because that's where he starts actually coming into his own and having adventures. His most common word is plenty, which he says 90 times, so that's like nearly a tenth of his dialogue, and fella, which he says 45 times. So as time goes on, he gets more lines, continues to have the same small number of words. That's because he's on screen more. He's doing more in the later books. He's having more adventures. And while, he does have this very stereotyped, use of the word plenty, again, I have to say, Murty O'Toole appears to have been in Australia for decades, and yet he still speaks with a broad Irish accent. Dialect, it's Bruce's besetting sin. Okay, and here's a question that I'm posed to myself. Was Billy the stockworker paid? So, under the legislation at the time, his wages should have been paid to a local guardian of Aboriginal people, and the benefit could then be used for his. The money could be used for his benefit. And Mr. Linton probably would have been his guardian, so they always put the station owners in the position of being both the employer and the person who held the money in the bank. Of course, Mr. Linton would have, not taken advantage of that, and because he's a gentleman. And how much would he have been paid? Don't know. I can say that in 1919, the government were claiming that Aboriginal pastoral workers got 2/3 of the white wage, but in 1949, the actual pay records show that they were getting about 31%. And it is in 1946 that the famous Pilbara strike took place on stations in Western Australia, the state I come from, because they weren't being paid at all. They went on strike for nearly 3 years to get paid, because they at that point were not paid for their labour at all. But I'm going to assume that the Lintons paid him and that they actually gave him the money because they are nice people. But under the legislation in place at the time, they were under no obligation to do so. And I will also say that, I think Bruce's ideas about Aboriginal people did change over time. And one of the ways that you can see this is, Billy getting more dialogue as time goes on. But another is, where's my book? For instance, she was sufficiently interested in Aboriginal legends that she, in 1922, wrote a series of short stories which are versions of Aboriginal legends. It didn't sell very well, but it's an indication of her increasing interest in the area. I just wanted to add a little bit here about race in the Billabong books. I always have that. So I had originally recorded a section asking, is Billy paid? And the answer historically is Aboriginal workers were meant to be paid about 1/3 of what the white workers were paid, but they didn't get given the money. It got held for them by a responsible person. So in this case, probably Mr. Linton would pay him, but also hold the money, and then the Chief Protector of Aboriginal people would allow the Aboriginal people to spend their money if he approved of whatever it was they wanted to spend it on. So in WA, when the Chief Protector, would receive letters that would say, "Can I buy, some clothes?" And the answer's almost always no. No. A car? No. Can I spend my own money? No. So that was a scenario for Billy. But of course, because the Lintons are nice, I'm going to assume that they paid him properly and that they actually let him access the money that he earned. And that was all kind of hypothetical. And then I discovered that I had not read an entire book. I had not read this one, Dick Lester of Kurrajong. So doing this program has allowed me to realise that there are 2 Mary Grant books Bruce books that I thought, that I didn't realise existed. In both cases, I thought they were alternate titles for books, and it turned out, no, they were both duologies. So I had Dick, but it turns out there's a sequel, Dick Lester of Kurrajong. And I had Peter and Co., but it turns out there's also Told by Peter. So, this has been a very fruitful process for me because I discovered whole books that I had not read. Now, I have to say, Dick Lester of Kurrajong, published in 1920, is a bit of a dud. May actually be my least favourite Mary Grant Bruce. It's the only one set in Western Australia. They go on a holiday from Victoria through South Australia to WA and then up inland to a station to stay with some people. And it's while they're there, they get attacked by wild natives, which is just within the realms of possibilities, because the last of the frontier massacres were going on at that time. And by massacres, I mean actually black people were being killed, but, occasionally a white person, I suppose. So it's just within the realms of possibility. But while they're there, all of the workers that are at that station are Aboriginal, and there are no less than 3 lengthy conversations about why they don't get paid. They don't get paid because it would just spoil them. It would spoil them if they got paid. Money just would corrupt them, so they shouldn't be paid. And there's also a lot of complaining about how terrible they are as workers and how they just keep leaving and going off and doing other stuff. I'm like, well, I'd leave and go off and do other stuff if I wasn't actually paid to do my job. I too would, just go walk about occasionally. So I found this to be an extremely annoying book, but, any Bruce is a good Bruce. I was pleased to find it. And it did actually answer the question that I'd hypothetically posed to myself. So that's good. Anyway, I wanted to add that. The person whose hen house is destroyed by Bill's bomb is a little old lady, but she loves movies, and she and Bill bond over movies. Let me read you the description. To his amazement, he discovered that she liked films, that she could talk about them. Not the sort of films that bored him, but really sensible ones, the only kind he thought worth seeing. Fighting films, planes, Wild West, all kinds of adventures. This remarkable old lady seemed to like them as much as he did. They grew quite excited over cinema memories, one following another with, "Oh, and did you see?" Miss Barbara's discourse on pictures was sprinkled with expressions that often made him shake inwardly with laughter, but there was no doubt she was a kindred soul. I find that fascinating because it's 1935, and rather than the many literary references that you find in the earlier books, we're now moving into the world of movies. We'll note, though, that as early as Billabong's daughter, the little bank thief that they send on his way, had been inspired by a movie about Ned Kelly. Overall, it's another of those tiresome goldmine books. They are not my favourites. I do not love them with my whole heart. I can't believe that they're spun out over 3 books. But they are. Anyway, there's another whole goldmine book to come, I'm afraid. Not my favourite, but any Bruce is a good Bruce.